impressions they gave were that he was kind of a quiet individual, withdrawn, one who was non-violent variety, definitely.
Richard Trenton Chase was born on the 23rd of May, 1950 in Santa Clara County, California. The neighborhood was quiet, middle-class rows of modest houses, trimmed lawns, and a sense of order. From the outside, the Chase family looked like any other. But inside their home, things were far from peaceful. His father, Richard Sr., was a strict, disciplined man who believed in control and authority. His mother, Beatrice, was anxious and emotionally unstable, prone to sudden mood swings and paranoia. Their marriage was a constant cycle of arguments, cold silences, and brief truces that never lasted. When they fought, it was loud voices echoing through the small house, doors slamming, the sound of things breaking. When they didn't fight, it was worse. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable, the kind that made you want to hold your breath. Richard was a quiet child, often retreating to his room during these moments. He learned early to stay out of sight, to wait for the noise to pass. At school, he seemed like an average kid at first. He wasn't aggressive or disruptive. Teachers remembered him as polite but detached, like his mind was somewhere else. He spent most of his time alone, though not completely isolated. In his teenage years, he managed to make friends, go to parties, and even date a few girls. But there was something that always seemed to haunt him, something he didn't talk about openly. He suffered from impotence, and that became a source of deep shame and insecurity. It made him feel broken, different, and unworthy. Each failed attempt to connect left him more withdrawn, more convinced that something inside him wasn't right. By the time he reached high school, those insecurities began to shape how he saw himself. He started to believe his body was failing him, that his heart would stop, that his blood was disappearing, that he was slowly dying from the inside. No one around him realized how serious his thoughts had become. To most people, he was just quiet, maybe a little strange, but nothing alarming. Behind that silence, Richard Chase's mind was already starting to fracture.
That he needed extensive care, receiving as much care as he should have gotten or could have gotten, and the whole thing is just a tragedy.
You're sending out letters now? Letters to families, the survivors?
Trying to tell them how sorry we are.
After finishing high school, Richard Chase tried to live a normal life. He attended college for a short period in Sacramento, but didn't stay long. His grades slipped, his motivation faded, and he began drifting away from people. What looked like laziness or disinterest from the outside was actually something much darker, beginning to take hold inside his mind. When he finally moved out of his parents' home, things started to unravel fast. He rented small apartments, usually by himself. His old friends noticed how different he seemed, pale, anxious, always tired. He barely ate, rarely cleaned, and spoke about strange things that made no sense to anyone else. Around this time, Richard began using drugs, LSD, marijuana, alcohol, anything to quiet the noise in his head. But instead of helping, it made his paranoia worse. He started talking about how his body didn't work properly, how he could feel his blood drying up, how his organs were moving around. He believed something was wrong inside him, that his heart would stop unless he did something to fix it. He often appeared in public wearing mismatched clothes, his hair unwashed, his expression distant. Some people said he looked like he was fading away. He told friends bizarre things, that someone was stealing his blood, that his body heat was dropping, that he could feel bones shifting under his skin. He would sometimes hold oranges to his head, saying he was absorbing vitamin C through his skull. Other times, he'd claim his stomach was missing or his arteries were blocked. He wasn't pretending. He genuinely believed every word. His father tried to help, but Richard refused to listen. His mother thought doctors were exaggerating his problems. That split in how his parents saw him, one seeing a son in danger, the other seeing a system overreacting, left Richard completely unprotected. Eventually, the paranoia got worse. He began carrying guns, convinced that someone was following him. He thought people were plotting to poison him, to take his energy. He would lie on the floor for hours, silent, staring at the ceiling, lost in his thoughts. His behavior had become impossible to ignore. His friends cut him off. Neighbors complained about strange smells and noises. He lived like a ghost in his own apartment alone, hallucinating, convinced that his blood and life were being stolen by unseen forces. In 1976, after several alarming incidents, Richard Chase was finally sent to a psychiatric hospital. Doctors diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, a severe and chronic mental illness. Inside the hospital, he told staff he needed blood to survive. He believed that his heart would stop if he didn't have it. For a short time, he received medication and care, and slowly he seemed to stabilize. He talked more clearly, smiled occasionally, followed the rules. The doctors thought he was improving.
Well, I voiced my objections to the then director of nurses that I didn't feel, as well as many other members of the staff, that Richard was safe to be returned to society.
So in 1976, less than a year after being committed, Richard Chase was released from the hospital into his mother's care. It was meant to be a supervised recovery medication, follow-ups, and family support. But that plan fell apart almost immediately. His mother, Beatrice, believed her son didn't need the drugs anymore. She had her own history of mental instability and thought the medication was making him worse, not better. So she quietly took him off his prescriptions. Within weeks, the change was obvious. Richard became withdrawn again. He stopped eating properly, lost weight, and began pacing the house for hours. Not long after, he moved out on his own again. This time, he lived in a small apartment in Sacramento, and there, the isolation became total. Inside his apartment, police would later find evidence of what he was doing. He'd buy small animals, kill them, and drink their blood. Sometimes, he'd blend their organs, mixing them with Coca-Cola and drink the mixture. Richard had full freedom now, and with no one to control his delusions, they began to control him. So he bought a gun, and he began hunting. On the 29th of December, 1977, 1-year-old Ambrose Griffin, a family man, was helping his wife unload groceries when a car drove by slowly. 2 shots rang out. Ambrose fell to the ground dead instantly. His wife screamed for help, having no idea that the bullet came from a stranger who saw the act as a test. That stranger was Richard Chase. And this was only the beginning. Weeks later, on the 23rd of January 1978, Richard entered the home of Teresa Wallen, a 2-year-old woman who was 3 months pregnant. She was taking out the trash when he shot her once in the hand, then once in the head. What happened next was beyond comprehension. He mutilated her body and used a cup to drink her blood. When police later found the scene, they described it as one of the most disturbing they had ever witnessed. But Richard saw it differently. He thought he had healed himself. He believed he'd absorbed life energy. 4 days later, he struck again. This time, he entered the home of Evelyn Miroth, a mother of 2 who was babysitting her 2-month-old nephew. Also present were her 6-year-old son Jason and a visiting friend named Dan Meredith. When Dan walked into the bathroom, he found Chase holding a gun. Dan tried to escape. Chase shot him in the head. Then he turned his attention to Evelyn and the children. By the time police arrived, everyone inside was dead. Chase had done things too graphic to describe, but one small clue would seal his fate. A single handprint, left in blood, perfectly clear on a wall. Police worked non-stop. They connected the cases, linked the ammunition, and gathered witness descriptions. When they tracked down Chase's apartment, they prepared for a nightmare. And that's exactly what they found. Inside were blood-stained walls, blenders filled with decaying organs, cups, bottles, and containers coated with blood. In the fridge, animal parts, human remains, and newspaper clippings about his crimes. Even the kitchen sink was red. They arrested him on the spot, and Richard didn't resist. He was calm. He seemed almost relieved. During questioning, he told detectives strange things, that he was being followed by a group called the Nazi UFO organization, that they were trying to turn his blood into powder, that he had to kill in order to live. He spoke of blood transfusions, of poisoned soap, of invisible forces. He wasn't lying. He believed every word. At his trial in 1979, his defense argued insanity, that he was deeply schizophrenic and couldn't understand right from wrong. But the jury disagreed. They saw not just a man with illness, but someone who had carefully prepared his crimes. Richard Chase was convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death in the gas chamber. But he wouldn't make it that far. In December 1980, just 2 years after his arrest, Richard was found dead in his cell. He'd saved up his antidepressants for weeks, taking them all at once to end his own life. His story became a symbol of how untreated mental illness can twist a human being into something unrecognizable, not because of evil, but because of complete collapse. Richard Chase's life began like anyone else's in an ordinary house, with parents, school, and friends. But somewhere along the way, reality broke, and no one was there to catch him when he fell. That's it for today's video. If you found it interesting, check out my last video where I talk about one of the most terrifying killers to walk among us. And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe so you can help me put out more videos like this. Thank you so much for watching. See ya.